Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back, possibly, if this isn't your first session, to Meeting Minds Global. If you just bear with 1 second, whilst I'm admitting everybody. Okay. Oh, no. All right. So welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, morning or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And thank you all for coming and coming and coming. I hope you've all been able to enjoy some of the other sessions over the last couple of days of Meeting Minds. Right, so my name, for anyone who hasn't seen me before, which a fair few of you probably won't have, my name's Nicola. I'm the Alumni Relations Officer at Kellogg College. And I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If I can ask everyone to please stay muted during the talk itself, just so there's no sort of sound interference or anything strange, that would be much appreciated. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask at that point. If you're feeling a bit shy, you can put in the chat box, but please feel free to use the raise your hand option as well. I do also want to note this session is being recorded. So if you are not comfortable leaving your video feed on for that reason, that's fine. Just wanted to let everybody know about that. Sorry, we've still got people joining us, which is fantastic. Okay, so our speaker this afternoon on the subject of Freud and his time in London, amongst other things, I'm sure, is Alistair Ross. As well as being an official fellow of Kellogg College, Alistair is Director of Psychodynamic Studies and Associate Professor in Psychotherapy at the Department for Continuing Education. He trained at the Universities of Leicester and Birmingham, and in addition to his work in psychotherapy and psychodynamics, he's an accredited Baptist minister and associated member of the theology faculty at Oxford, which is something I did not know. So you learn something new every day. Alistair's interest in Sigmund Freud's life and work is long-standing, as you may be able to see from all the volumes on Freud behind him. So rather than continuing to chatter on, I will hand over to him to tell you more. Welcome, Alistair.
Thanks very much, Nicola. There'll be some people joining us as we go through, and the other thing to say is that I will be using some PowerPoints from time to time, just to give you some visual light relief from having to look at me chunnering away. Having written quite a lot about Freud, I thought it'd be quite interesting just I keep on discovering things about Freud that some people may know, some people may not know. And so I thought I'd talk about Freud's time in London, because that's we're in the UK. You're spread all the way around the country and all the way around the world, but at least you'll have some sense of what London is. So I'm going to talk about that. So on the 5th of June 1938, a frail, cancer-ridden 82-year-old man boarded the Orient Express bound for Paris. He, his wife, daughter, maid, doctor, and dog left Vienna, that had been their home for 78 years, driven out by the Nazi regime. If he'd stayed, in all likelihood, he would have died in a concentration camp, as did 3 of his sisters. Before he left, he had to sign an official document on which he wrote with characteristic humor, quote, "I can most highly recommend the Gestapo to everyone," unquote. A stopover to see friends and family in Paris, he boarded the night ferry at the Gare du Nord, which took him across the English Channel, arriving on platform 2 of Victoria Station in London the following morning at 9:10 a.m. Even at this hour, there was a crowd of several thousand people waiting to welcome Sigmund Freud. Freud had actually crossed the Channel twice before. Once in 1875, traveling via Rotterdam, the ferry from Rotterdam to Hull, and by boat, and then train to visit his half-brothers in Manchester. And he visited them again in 1908. And on that occasion, he did come to London. Freud did say to his friend, Edward Silberstein, that he could see himself in England. Now, just in case there's people here from all four nations that make up the United Kingdom, Freud used the word England, but he did understand, that there was separate traditions within it, including the Celts, the Welsh, and the Scotch, as he would say. But generally, when he used the word England, he's referring to the British nation as a whole. And he felt at home here, and he wrote, despite, quote, its fog and rain, drunkenness and conservatism, unquote. So clearly, for all our advances, England hasn't improved very much over the last century or so. But London as a place lived in Freud's psyche and emerged in his work on dreams. In his first visit to London in 1908, in 1875, he'd been to Manchester, he reflected on, quote, its glory, nobility, purity, and elegance. The English are a really agreeable people. And by the way, the cigars are excellent. Freud wrote he had little time to shop. He had to replace some cravats damaged by seawater leaking into his trunk on his travels, because he wanted to visit the world famous British Museum and immerse himself in their collection of Egyptian antiquities. This was much larger than the collection that was in the museum in Vienna. And the British Museum was founded in 1753. It became the first national public museum in the world and was based on a collection of 71,000 items that Sir Hans Sloane left to the nation. But from 1894 to 1924, the curator of the English or the Egyptian collection was someone called Wallace Budge, and he expanded the collection through his 3 trips to Egypt, Sudan, and Mesopotamia. And these were all displayed on 3 galleries on several floors of the museum. And Budge wrote many books that Freud collected. So they're still in his library in the Freud Museum today. Freud stayed at the fashionable Ford's Hotel in Manchester Street in Marylebone, near where in the future his daughter Matilda Hollister would own a woman's fashion shop on Baker Street, and where his grandson Stefan, he anglicised that to Stephen Freud, would run a hardware store. But what Freud did was he purchased museum guides in advance. He spent each night reading these in preparation for his visit the following day, and it was a 30-minute walk from his hotel. As the museum was closed on Sundays, Freud walked through Hyde Park. I'm just going to, he walked through Hyde Park. So everybody hopefully can see, so there's Freud himself with one of his cigars. But he walked through Hyde Park and ended up, he experienced Speaker's Corner, he went to Kensington Gardens, and then the Albert Memorial, which had insets that included works by Goethe and Schiller. And it ended up at Speke's Monument, an obelisk commemorating the discovery of the Nile. And Freud used this analogy in some writing in 1896 for the discovery of the source of anxiety as a childhood sexual trauma. He said it was as monumental psychologically as discovering the Nile. Freud also visited Westminster Abbey, where he linked the tombs of Elizabeth I to Lady Macbeth, viewing them both as hysterics. Freud also managed to squeeze in a visit to the National Gallery and made some comments about what a portrait reveals about a person. But steeped in British history, Freud continually referred to William Shakespeare and to Oliver Cromwell. But in his 1909 lecture at Clark University in the United States, he referred specifically to Londoners. He illustrated anxiety by referring to the present day Londoners filled with grief over the death of their 13th century queen, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, or another weeping over the Great Fire of London in 1666, which destroyed an estimated 80% of the homes in the city of London. And Freud was saying, he said, it's strange that people can be so affected by something in the past, yet feel the affect so powerfully in the present. He was saying the origins of anxiety lie in the past and often appear unconnected, but in fact can have huge impact and be felt very, very powerfully. Unexpectedly, and unbeknown to Freud, in 1909, his name appeared in a criminal case. Sorry, I'll just stop sharing the screen a moment. In a criminal case at England's most famous court, the Old Bailey, the London Central Criminal Court. One Henry Clifford was arrested for forgery, fraud, and bigamy, and he was in fact someone called Conrad Harms, and he was convicted for 6 years. He claimed that Freud of Vienna knew him as Henry Clifford, but no proof was ever actually produced. Obviously, quite a few things happened. The First World War, which was traumatic for everyone, but obviously the seeds of what was the rise of Hitler and the Nazi movement had their origins in the outcome of the First World War. And as time went by, it became very clear that if you were Jewish, it was going to be very difficult to remain in Germany. So the next Freud family member to arrive in London was Ernst Freud. This was Freud's eldest son, who trained as an architect. So with the growth of anti-Semitism that he was experiencing in Berlin, he immigrated with his family to London in 1933. And he set up an architecture practice from his home in St. John's Wood, designing several buildings around Hampstead in his own take of a Bauhaus-inspired modernist style. French, British, and American psychoanalysts, politics, and friends persuaded Freud to leave Vienna in 1938 after his youngest daughter, Anna, had been taken in for questioning by the Gestapo. What Freud didn't know was that their doctor had actually given her a cyanide pill in a false tooth in case she was going to be questioned or tortured by the Gestapo. But Freud was reluctant to leave his adopted city of Vienna, his home for 78 years. He was seriously ill with a progressive form of cancer of his mouth and jaw caused by his addiction to cigars. He was in constant pain. He had a failing heart, and he was partially deaf. But in the end, he decided to leave. After an exorbitant exit tax was paid, somewhere, estimates vary depending on inflation, but we're talking somewhere between half a million and £1 million were paid as an exit tax for Freud. All his antiquities and books were put together, shipped off, taxes paid, and so Freud arrived in London. Ernst, his son, had rented a home for his parents at 39 Ellsworthy Road in Primrose Hill, while designing improvements to 20 Maresfield Gardens in South Hampstead, which is now the Freud Museum, which we can nearly see a picture of. So this was Freud's home. This was it's now the Freud Museum, and the extension, Ernst put an extension on at the back, like a conservatory, where Freud could sit and experience the sunshine in the reign of Britain from time to time. So Freud did manage to get there, and was just overwhelmed by the fact that so many people knew who he was and wanted to welcome him to London. It was a hugely important event for him. The post office soon began delivering letters that were simply addressed Sigmund Freud, London. People had heard that his books were in transit from Austria and from elsewhere, and so they, as were his antiquities. And so sometimes people knowing of his love of antiquities simply sent him items for his collection to welcome him to Britain. His wife Martha enjoyed the cosmopolitan nature of London and would have settled much more easily had it not been for those she had left behind. The British Broadcasting Corporation recorded Freud speaking about his discovery of psychoanalysis, and they then settled in 20 Maresfield Gardens, the picture that was on the screen, which is between Swiss Cottage and Hampstead. Freud purchased it for £6,500 with a £4,000 loan from Barclays Bank. And the reason for that was because Freud's assets that were in a Dutch bank had been seized by the Nazis. And so he didn't have very much money. And so he had to take out a mortgage or a loan on this house. Freud settled into the home. He had this conservatory directly onto the garden, which he loved, where he could sit or walk with his chow dog called Loon, who roamed in freedom. And because of Freud's fame, many people wanted to come to London, to his London home, to meet him. And the two people that that were of particular interest, partly because more's been written about this visit than others, two of the people that visited him, the first was Salvador Dali, and the second was Leonard and Virginia Woolf. But I'm going to begin with Salvador Dali. Just in case you're, here's one picture of him, quite an intriguing character. He was born in 1904. He was a brilliant and mercurial Catalan painter, sculptor, and showman. His full name was Salvador Felipe Jacinto Dali y Domenech, known as simply Dali, but he created memorable images associated with surrealism. He produced two ethereal pieces of religious art, St. John of the Cross, which is in the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery Museum in Glasgow, and the Sacrament of the Last Supper, which is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Born in northern Spain, Dali had a difficult and disturbed upbringing. He was named after his brother, who died before Dali was born, and this brother became his alter ego. So when visiting the cemetery to place flowers at the gravestone, it bore his own name, which has an element of surrealism about it too. But certainly things were to get worse. His father was obsessed with sex, and it's believed that Dali's brother died due to venereal disease coming from his father's visits to prostitutes. He warned Dali of these dangers by giving him books containing grotesque, almost surreal images of lesions caused by syphilis. So Dali subsequently associated sexuality with frightening images, and sex with another person became repulsive to him. So for Dali, death, the identity of the body, and the phallic symbolism featured prominently in his art. He moved to Madrid in 1921, where he discovered emerging avant-garde artists and filmmakers such as Buñuel. And it's there he began to develop his distinctive persona and artistic style. Dali had read Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, which directed his thinking to the idea that dreams are central to human thought and creativity. Through dreams, the unconscious can be accessed to provide surreal artistic inspiration and expression. And in many of Dali's pictures, there's a surreal, unconscious, dreamlike quality. Anyway, Dali moved to Paris in 26, where he met Picasso. He fell in love with Gala. He met the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, turned his attention to some surrealist film, but he never quite gained the degree of recognition or notoriety that he wanted. And so Dali pursued his own singular and unique vision. And in a series of exhibitions around Europe and New York, it brought Dali worldwide attention and subsequently divided the art world. Some found his surrealist art sensational, and others rejected his grandiose persona and self-promotion. But in 1931, Dali produced one of his most famous works, The Persistence of Memory.
Did you want to share screen, Alistair?
That would be really helpful if I could do that.
Thank you.
Does that come up now?
That's better, lovely.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much for reminding me. So this is one of his most famous works, and that, along with Melting Clocks, set in a barren landscape being devoured by ants. So this is the reproduction that I'm at this scale that I've been allowed to produce copyright free. The more detailed ones do require a copyright in order to look at the real details. But for Dali, the transitory nature of time and ultimate decay is all too evident. And so when Dali visited Freud, you have this fascinating encounter between someone who's painting about decay and the transitory nature of time, where everything becomes distorted, with someone who's experiencing those forces in his body. Dali had visited Vienna on 3 occasions, hoping to meet Freud, only to discover he was absent for health reasons. And Dali writes, "I remember with a gentle melancholy spending those afternoons walking haphazardly around the streets of Austria's ancient capital. The chocolate tart, which I would hurriedly eat between the short intervals from going from one antiquary to another, had a slightly bitter taste. In the evening, I held long and exhaustive imaginary conversations with Freud." And then in 1936, he produced a painting or a sculpture called The Anthropomorphic Cabinet, expressed his vision that the human body is full of secrets, which, like drawers, can only psychoanalysis can open. So you have in Dali someone who was trying to work out in the same way many of the ideas that Freud had written about. So when he discovered that Dali was in London, and so was Freud, one of Dali's acquaintances was the Austrian novelist Stefan Zweig, who'd moved to London in 1935. He got Zweig to make an introduction for Dali and his patron, Edward James. And it was James who owned Dali's The Metamorphosis of Narcissus, which you can see here, which is now was then bought by the Tate Gallery in London. And Dali came hoping to engage Freud in discussion and to link it with the psychoanalytic theory of narcissism. Afterwards, Freud wrote to Zweig, quote, "I really have reason to thank you for the introduction which brought me yesterday's visitors. For until then, I was inclined to look upon surrealists, who have apparently chosen me for their patron saint, as absolute, let us say 95%, like alcohol, cranks. This young Spaniard, however, with his candid, fanatical eyes and his undeniable technical mastery, has made me reconsider my opinion. So I'm going to just stop sharing the screen now, because I want to show you something from a magazine. During the visit, Dali made several pencil sketches of Freud, but Zweig declined to let Freud see them because he felt that they portrayed Freud too starkly. And for copyright reasons, I haven't been able to reproduce these, but they are in a magazine from the Freud Museum, and so I can simply show you on screen. So this was one image. I'm not quite sure how much detail you can see of that, but it's of Freud's head, almost like a snail-like creature, and it was done in pencil. Another was of his work was, again, you can see how prominent and how skeleton-like the skull is, and the fading of the flesh. And then Dali also did one just in pen and ink, literally while he was talking to Freud, showing this man nearly asleep, fading. You know, these are not pictures of health, but Zweig felt that they were too revealing for them, these gaunt spectral images. And yet we have every reason to believe that they were completely accurate. And one of those sketches, the first one, hangs in the landing of the Freud Museum in London. Dali claims that Freud said to him, quote, "When I look at a formal work of art, I look for evidences of the subconscious. When I look at surrealist work of art, I'm looking for evidence of the conscious." Although Dali attributed this to Freud, I think it's fairly unlikely that Freud actually said that. Dali was quite capable of being his own PR machine and presenting himself in his own way. Up until that time, Freud had had very limited exposure or interest in the surrealist movement. And at the time, he was being sculpted by Catalevi's son, Peter Lambda, who recalls this conversation while Freud was sitting for him. Catalamdi was family friends from Budapest. And he writes, "We talked a bit each time, and I now wish I'd written down every word each day, but unfortunately I didn't. I do remember one conversation he asked me, had I heard of a man called Dali? When I said I had, he told me that Stefan Zweig had brought Dali along to see him the day before, and that Dali had said that he, Freud, had something to do with surrealism. Could I enlighten him what Dali could have meant? Because to him, it didn't make any sense. I confess, this is Peter Lambda speaking, I didn't really understand surrealism. And I suggested that perhaps the surrealists were depicting dreams and free associations. And he shook his head. These were no art. They were raw material. In the end, we agreed that art, as we understood it, creates order out of chaos, not vice versa, Dali or no Dali. So Dali was a provocative artist balancing genius with eccentricity, but committed to discovering and working with the unconscious. His contribution to surrealism was this psychoanalytic dimension expressed through his unique symbolism and style. His contribution to psychoanalysis was to reinforce the importance of creativity and sexuality expressed through dreams and the working of the unconscious in through art and popular culture. What I'm going to do now is to turn to another figure who visited Freud, and that's Leonard and Virginia Woolf. And again, can everybody see that? Share. No?
No.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. We got it there? Yeah, great. So you can't really imagine anyone more opposite to Dali than Virginia Woolf. Leonard's and Virginia's Hogarth Press had been Freud's English publisher since 1924. And so literature and publication was close to Freud's heart. So when the Freuds arrived in London, Leonard inquired if Freud would be willing to meet himself in Virginia. And so they were invited for tea on Saturday, the 28th of January, 1939, which Leonard recalls in his diaries. Both Leonard Woolf and Virginia Woolf kept diaries. And so they're often a great source of, fascinating source of reflection and insight. Leonard wrote, Freud, quote, had an aura not of fame, but of greatness. There was something about him as of a half-extinct volcano. He gave me a feeling of great gentleness, but behind the gentleness, great strength. Leonard recounted a newspaper story about a thief who had stolen many books, including one of Freud's from a London bookshop. The magistrate stated that they wished they could sentence the thief to read all of Freud's books as punishment, which Freud thought was very, very amusing. Freud wrote to Leonard after his visit, quote, he said, handicapped in the use of your language, I think I could not give my full expression to my satisfaction of having met you and your lady, unquote. As Freud's command of English was impressive, it is likely he was referring obliquely to his partial deafness and the limitations of speech caused by his prosthesis. And yet Virginia Woolf, one of the most innovative writers in the early 20th century through such novels as Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, these early modern novels employ a stream of consciousness where we discover the inner lives of her characters and their individual subjectivity and intersubjectivity. So for Woolf and the other modernist writers, the focus is on the interiority of the self. And Woolf believed the point of interest lies very likely in the dark places of psychology. And so she begins to explore these issues in herself. She was part of the Bloomsbury group, some of whom adopted Freud's ideas, some of whom, including her brother Adrian and his wife Karen, became analysts. So just get rid of that. So Virginia had very mixed feelings about this psychoanalysis. She wrote a book, a critical essay in 1920 called Freudian Fiction, despite not having read any Freud, but concerned by psychological reductionism. And yet this continued. In her letter to colleagues, she said that she wasn't sure what this meant. And in her meals with James Strachey, a British psychoanalyst, James in his diary writes, Virginia made more than an unusually ferocious onslaught against psychoanalysts and psychoanalysts, more particularly the latter. And yet she too had her own struggles that required a great deal of help. Throughout her life, she'd struggled with poor health, physical and emotional. She'd experienced depression, anorexia, and breakdowns caused by a combination of early losses. Her mother died when she was 13. The same year when she was sexually exploited by her half-brothers, which had profoundly negative effects upon her. She had a very difficult relationship with her father, hindered by his deafness, melancholy, excessive emotionalism, and subsequent bereavements. And so discussing with Leonard why he had not persuaded Virginia to see a psychoanalyst about her mental breakdowns, she concluded, Virginia's imagination, apart from her artistic creativeness, was so interwoven with her fantasies and indeed with her madness, that if you had stopped the madness, you might have stopped the creativeness too. So looking back at her life now, her symptoms would suggest manic depression or bipolar disorder, and there was certainly quite a number of suicide attempts. She found some security in relationships. She had a love affair with Vita Sackville-West, but she was very committed in her marriage to Leonard, whom she loved deeply. And she violently resisted any simplistic Freudian explanation of her life through childhood trauma. And yet, she records this meeting with Freud. And she wrote to say, a good deal of psychoanalysis talked, and I liked it. We're going to see the great Freud on Saturday. She said, Dr. Freud gave me a Narcissus, was sitting in a great library with little statues at a largely scrupulously tidy, shiny desk. We were like patients on chairs, a screwed up, shrunken, very old man, inarticulate but alert. On Hitler, generation before the poison will be worked through. Fame, I was infamous rather than famous. Difficult talk, an interview. Daughter and Martin helped. Immense potential. I mean, an old fire now flickering. They considered leaving for 3 months, but made up their minds in 24 hours. Very alert at Leonard's mention of the case where the judge decreed the criminal should read 20 of Freud's books. Commenting on Maysfield Gardens, we don't like it as well as our flat in Vienna, Anna said. And yet, what happened subsequent to this meeting was that Virginia Woolf began to read many of Freud's books, including Thoughts for the Time of War and Death from 1915, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, Civilization and its Discontents, Why War, and Moses and Monotheism. And she writes, began to read Freud last night to enlarge the circumference, to give my brain a wider scope, to make it objective, to get outside. I'm gulping it up Freud. Freud is upsetting, reducing one to whirlpool, and I dare say truly, if we're all instincts, the unconscious, what's all this about civilization? She was still reading Freud the following summer as the Battle of Britain began, when she, quote, tried to center by reading Freud, a trusted friend. Reading Freud disturbed, inspired, and challenged Woolf, who took up several of Freud's key ideas in her later book, 3 Guineas, and the essays, The Leaning Tower and The Sketch of the Past. In her last years, she revealed more of her immense potential, which she had so presently observed in Freud. Depressed and in despair, on the 28th of March, 1941, she drowned herself, leaving a note for Leonard saying, quote, I don't think 2 people could have been happier than we have been. And so we have seen an immense interest in literary studies in Virginia Woolf's work. And it's clear that the volcano that she saw in Freud and psychoanalysis, the fire that she saw burning embers of, continued to glow, and the volcano continued to erupt. Jacqueline Rose believes Freud, quote, took, quote, Freud even further along the paths, which it feels as if he was reluctant or only occasionally willing to tread. I think I'm nearly running out of time, so I'm just checking. Are we okay for another couple of minutes? Another 5 minutes? Yeah. So they were the 2 visits that probably the 2 most famous visitors that Freud had when they moved to London in 1938. But it was clear that his cancer was at not only a very advanced state, and so a second opinion was sought about his cancer. in July 38, he wrote to his daughter Anna, who was attending the International Psychoanalytic Congress in Paris, quote, "Radium man due today." The radium man was Dr. Carter Brain, whose Freud wrote, "A stolid Englishman. I didn't impress him and he wants to see me again." But they decided that his cancer was inoperable after another growth, because an operation would have required dividing the lip, cutting the nose to get access to the tumor in the cheek. And radium was the only thing that could be offered. But while there was a plan for him to go to Paris to the Institut de Curie, that wasn't possible. His cancer, he says, "There has been a new occurrence of my dear old cancer, which I have been sharing my existence with for 16 years. Indecision was never part of him, but he said, he wrote to his friend Marie Bonaparte, "The radium has once more begun to eat in with pain and toxic effects, and my world is again what it was before, an island of pain floating on a sea of indifference." Freud knew his time was up when his favorite beloved child Lung flinched from coming near him because of the smell coming from the feted wound in his cheek. And so Freud died on the 23rd of September, 1939. A remorseless march of cancer had come to an end, where after the administration of a lethal injection of morphine, ending his pain and suffering. In a very quintessentially British way, Freud's death and the funeral arrangements were made by the department store Harrods of Knightsbridge, who were appointed as funeral directors for a funeral at Golders Green Cemetery. And later Ernst Freud designed the Sigmund Freud Memorial there. So Freud's story ends in a London cemetery in the land of this agreeable people, the English. This refugee fleeing ethnic cleansing has so much to teach us still about glory, nobility, purity, and elegance, but only if we're willing to recognize our inner destructive and unconscious forces. These have been so prevalent in our Brexit times. Our enemy is not the European, the people of different color and ethnicity, the foreigner, the northerner, or the southerner. The enemy that we have to face and conquer is ourselves. So I'm going to stop at that point, and I'm going to try and receive any questions that people might want to ask. You can do that by simply unmuting yourself and speaking out loud, and I will try briefly, which I always find a bit difficult, to answer any of your questions, or if there's anything you wanted to comment or to add from my meandering around Freud in London with you today.
So I'll ask a question if I may, Alistair.
Yep.
What happened, so after Freud died, so actually just moving the story on a little bit, after Freud died, what happened to his family? They stayed in London?
Well, one of his daughters early on had moved to America before the 1900s. They pretty much all moved to London. So Ernst Freud was one. Martin had he enlisted in the army, but a number of Freud's sons were interned because they were described as enemy aliens. And it was only because some people mounted a public campaign that they were able to be released. But they then served in the expeditionary forces. There was an elite group, and Martin Freud writes stories about being parachuted behind enemy lines in France to continue the fight. His daughter Anna stayed in the Freud home and effectively continued to look after her mother, who was there who died in the early 50s. But the rest of Freud's own family, all Freud's sisters died in the concentration camps. They were all, and it's just a terrible, terrible statistic. But every Jew that remained in Vienna in 1939 died in the concentration camps.
Okay, thank you.
Alistair, Alistair, we've got a gentleman with his hand up. Fred,
Yep.
would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I have a couple of peripheral questions. The photo that you showed of the Freud Museum, is that how it would have appeared in 1938, or has it been touched up since then?
Fred, if you're ever over in Britain, and get the chance to go to the Freud Museum, it's wonderful because it hasn't been touched up at all. In fact, it's remarkably the same. So that's not been touched. They'll have painted the windows, but that's exactly what the house would have looked like at the time. And if you go in there, they've pretty much kept it as it was from. Anna Freud remained there until her death in the 1980s, and then she left the house in trust, and so it became the Freud Museum.
Well, hopefully I will get to London yet again one of these years. Who knows? The other question I was when you said that his arrangements were done by Harrods. Was that something they did a lot of then? And how long did that go on?
That was complete news to me, and it's the only, but clearly Harrods was a place that was where you went. Harrods prided itself on nothing being too difficult or unobtainable. And so, but I've not actually read anywhere else of them doing this, but I do think they obviously had a funeral directors attached to them. So that would be, that's adds a whole new dimension to what department stores might offer. But it fitted with Harrods' view that nothing was too difficult for them to obtain for their customers.
Alistair, I can see we've got some messages in the chat. So we've got a question from Rahul. Do you think teaching Freud's life story in schools would help dispel some of the anti-immigrant sentiment in the global north? It's one question. And we've got Helen, who's asking which of Freud's writing is most relevant today.
I'll try and answer those briefly. In terms of the global north, I do think that we still have got a great deal of teaching to do about our capacity to deal with the person who's the foreigner, the other. We've seen it played out again and again. And I think telling Freud's life story from the perspective of him being a refugee, I think, is really, really important, and about what that means. So I think there's a good vehicle there for doing that. And I think it was last year or the year before, the Freud Museum put on a special exhibition about, Freud being a refugee and how important that was, that all need to be welcomed. So yes, I think that there's an opportunity there, particularly if we can get into his teaching about what is it that alienates us from the other, and Freud would say, well, we have to begin with looking at the destructive forces inside ourselves. So yeah, I think that would be that. Which of Freud's teaching or which of his writing is most relevant? That's quite hard for me to answer, because I have read, well, you can, there are 24 volumes there, which I have to say I have read, and one thing about Freud is that if you can read some of his shorter work, it takes time because this is somebody who was writing from the middle of it or towards the end of the last century. So the way of writing has a slightly more formal style, and it won't, you're not just going to read it at like the latest best seller. One of the ones that I like that certainly got resonance is something called Mourning and Melancholia, which was written, I think, in 1917, which was about why is it that some people, what's the difference between mourning, i.e. a normal bereavement, and melancholia caused by a loss that seems so profound. But that's one there. It might be best if you were willing to just send me an email, and I can give you a small list of things to read. Yeah.
There are a couple of questions here in the chat that seem to relate to sort of literature. So shall I just pull those two together? There's one saying, there is a reference in his appointment book to a visit from a young Oxford professor, and there is a play, Freud's Last Session, featuring C.S. Lewis. Any evidence for a Lewis visit in 1938-9? And then the other literary one is, was there any or much acquaintance between Freud and Auden?
There was no visit between C.S. Lewis and Freud, and there was no connection with Auden. However, the play Freud's Last Session is a really imaginative and creative piece of writing. It's worth reading, and if it gets shown again, actually performed as a play, it's worth going to see. It's where these two great thinkers and philosophers engage with each other around issues of death, the future, mortality, immortality. So, but they didn't actually meet. And Auden, well, has got some very fun things to say about Freud.
I know we're nearly up to time. May we have one last question? Do we think we've got time for one last question? Yeah. So this is slightly similar to one we've had, but just which of Freud's theories are the most relevant or the most questionable from today's perspective?
The theory that has most relevance, it's easier to say than to explain, is the unconscious. Freud's great idea was that there is an unconscious at work, and that has really changed the way that idea is prevalent in just about everything in the 20th century. The area that he'd come under most criticism would be his Oedipus complex, partly because of the very gendered way in which there are patriarchal issues. Freud wasn't very good. He really liked women and had many women friends, but he wasn't actually very good about understanding feminine psychology. So I think Freud's Oedipus complex has got great value, but it certainly needs to be, it's one of those ideas that needs to be contextualized and brought up to date and refined by greater understanding from both same-sex and from gendered perspectives.
All right.
Okay.
I think that's all the questions in the chat have been answered. So I think this is probably a good stopping point here. Thank you, Alistair, so much for that talk. I've just learned a huge amount that I had no idea about. So that's always the goal with these things. And thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. And thank you to everyone for coming. And I hope you've taken something away from this as well.
Yeah, just to say, if anybody wants to send me an email or to follow up any conversation, it's just alistair.ross@kellogg.ox.ac.uk, or just send it through to somebody in the college, and Rebecca or
Yeah, we can
and
do that.
they'll send it through to me. So yeah, I'd be very happy to have conversations with anyone if anyone wants to follow up. Thanks, really good questions. Yeah, somebody's told me there about another famous British person, ex-Prime Minister, being buried through Harrods. So that's good to do. So I've learned something as well. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you so much,
Fantastic,
Alistair.
Alistair, thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was
Bye-bye.
terrific. Thank you.
Bye, Moira. Nice to see you.
Bye, Alistair. Speak soon.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.